Thank you for joining us today. I hope you jive to that as much as I do. I love that music. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Caleb. Unfortunately, Bryce will not be joining us today, so you get me. And we also are joined by Cindy Plaza. She will be filling in as co-host today. Thank you, Cindy, for joining us. She is also a part of the Secular Haven Network, which, by the way, I should also mention, for those who may not know, we are no longer Promethean Secular Frontier as a networking group. From henceforth and forevermore, we are going to be known as Skeptical Haven. And so we're proud to announce ourselves as such. And Cindy is also part of that network. She co-hosts and hosts a show called Women Atheists Unload. But more than that, she goes above and beyond. She has her own channel, also on YouTube. She calls it the Path to Reason. Very exciting stuff. And today we are going to be joined by Dr. Lorkowski. The topic of the conversation today is St. Aquinas. Is St. Aquinas a persuasive figure? Should we consider him persuasive? Dr. Lorkowski is a philosopher and also a doctor of world religions as well. But furthermore, he's also author of Atheism Considered, a survey of rational rejection. A survey of the rational rejection of religious belief. Thank you, Dr. Lorkowski. I'm going to do my best to transition. By the way, for the audience, I'm doing my best to try to start calling doctors doctor, but I'm going to slip up, and when I do, I'm going to call him Micky. So Dr. and Micky Lorkowski are the same person, just so you know. Thank you, Dr. Lorkowski, for joining us today. The topic was St. Aquinas, and before the show we were discussing that for all intents and purposes, the driving force was going to be how his arguments are just unpersuasive. That essentially and by the way, this isn't all we're going to talk about, but is that sort of the gist of why you're here today?
Yeah, that's why I was asked to speak. I think it's. You want me to dive in, or?
I'm so very sorry. Multitasking here in IRL. I'm sorry. So the St. Aquinas. Let's just go ahead and begin with if you don't mind, let's just go ahead and just dive into your book. I don't honestly have any idea if this has to do with Aquinas, but I do want to give you an opportunity before we even start anything to go ahead and just add spot your material. And it's obviously the thing that you're, at least at one point, extremely passionate about. So I'd like to give you an opportunity to discuss what that was and why you wrote the book.
Sure. Well, while I wrote the book, I was teaching a cross-listed philosophy and religion course on atheism at the University of Cincinnati. And when I was looking for mid-level texts that they didn't seem built right to me for the most part. There was a couple of good ones, but they tended to be a little bit archaic and a little bit more advanced. And what I mean by not being organized right is they spend most of their efforts on natural theology, that is, these syllogistic, abstract arguments that, even if they're successful, are not the grounds for people's belief. I've never met somebody who says, I'm a Christian because I was persuaded by a cosmological argument, and then I did further argumentation to figure out that the Bible was accurate. That's just not where belief lies. And so I think to provide kind of a suitable front for atheism as a worldview requires not just that you talk about why those kind of arguments are unpersuasive, but you also have to address things like moral problems and miracles and problems with sacred texts that are all inherent to revealed religion. And so that's what I was setting out to do and setting out to find. And when I couldn't find it, I was actually bemoaning this to a publisher at an American Philosophical Association meeting. He said, why don't you just write one? And I'm like, oh, well, okay. and here we are. So
Yeah, that's
in it,
actually really great. Like, if the book doesn't exist that you want, maybe you should make that book.
yeah.
That's actually a really good point. Okay, so with insofar as Saint Aquinas goes, obviously we're here to talk about Saint Aquinas primarily. But what is your number one critique? Like, when people consider themselves to be an Aquinas theologian or somebody that's special, like really admires this man and uses them as their center of focus or whatever. Like, what is your primary critique of this of the Aquinian worldview?
So I think there's an important distinction to be made. There's a couple of philosophers, historical philosophers, that have scholars and cultists. Levinas is one of them. I was actually talking to a Levinas scholar, and he was bemoaning the Levinas cultists to me. Deleuze is one of them, and Aquinas is one. And so there's some really, really good Aquinas scholarship out there, but then there's also the people who kind of view that the conversation literally just stops when you say Aquinas said X, and that's it. That's done. And that's a pet peeve because, first of all, I think Aquinas himself would absolutely hate that attitude. Aquinas has beliefs that obviously we all reject, but if you put yourself in 13th century Europe, he was he was a little more kind of in the avant-garde as far as these things go. So,
well, I mean, he was clearly raised above the rest. He was sort of like, I mean, well, he's a saint, so he's literally sanctified. At least so people admonish him on that front. But I mean, during his day, while he was a living human, he wasn't a saint, was he? I honestly don't know. Is that the case? Okay, so. But there's some really even unto that. Like, wasn't he the guy that allegedly flew around? And
no.
Well, that wasn't him. Who am I thinking of? Maybe you know who I'm thinking of.
No, I'm blanking on it. But no, he was a master of theology at the University of Paris. Was his main thing. But he was really one of the first ones to bring Aristotle into things. He was, but he was dealing with a bunch of Platonists, and Aquinas was very adamant that we had to start with sensory experience, rejected several types of reasoning, even though they were in favor of a God. And so he was intellectually honest. He didn't say, well, this argument supports God, so I have to accept it. And
so he sounds like a beneficial character in history. Yeah. So would you say that on the whole, we're better off having had the Aquinas than not?
Well, that's true of just about any philosopher I could name. More generally, like, there's theists you could have a beer with and have a good conversation with, and there's theists you can't. And Aquinas was very clearly in the former camp. He dialogued with Maimonides, who was Jewish, and Avicenna, who was Muslim. And so he was clearly not just this closed-minded Christian dogmatist. Now, again, doesn't mean I don't reject just about everything he ever said, but his mind was in the right place, his goals were right, his methodology was reasonable. Just as one extra example, Augustine, who people sometimes confuse with Aquinas, Augustine said curiosity was a vice. That is, it was a terrible thing, and Aquinas said, no, it is a virtue. Not only is it a virtue, but when you're answering theology questions, if all you do is appeal to authority, you've actually not contributed to human knowledge. And so he's very much not, Christian yes man. And so, of course, philosophy and theology couldn't really be separated at the time, but there's a lot to be said for it.
So it sounds to me like what you're saying is, at the time, at least if you were going to be a Christian, and it sounds like we, from the secular perspective, if we were around then and there, he might be the most relatable person around. Is that not really?
And I think, doubling down on that, I think that if all of us who are watching and participating in this were raised in that time period, I think probably 98% of us would also be Christian. So,
yeah. Well, I mean, that's kind of why I don't want to dog on him just because he's religious. That's why I'm like, well, it sounds like he sounds like.
And I won't dog on him at all. I'll dog on some of his arguments, but I won't dog on him. But I also won't fault him for not having a time machine.
All right, well, let's dog on a few of the arguments. Clearly, he was a theist, and we're here to critique him, whether or not he was an amazing human being or not, there's clearly things that we disagree with. The man was a theologian. I'm not. So on some level, we disagree. Where do you think we are likely to part ways immediately?
So you and he, probably some big picture principles in cosmology, honestly.
That's that was an unfair question, but you know what? You nailed it on the head. I'll bet you're right.
Well, no. I don't mean religiously. I mean, if you think in terms of the kind of premises that are required to give a cosmological argument off the ground, things like the universe requires an explanation, or anything that begins to exist has a cause, or infinite regresses are impossible. These really, really big causal axioms about cause and effect. Very often, at least in my findings, how people feel about cosmological arguments is entirely contingent on our metaphysical intuitions in those regards. And so I also use that to say, well, but that doesn't mean that theists sticking to cosmological arguments are doing something ad hoc or after the fact, or just trying to throw anything to the wall and see what it sticks. I think instead, if you're of a worldview that is leaning towards higher powers as an explanation that's satisfactory and satisfying in certain senses, you also lean towards those kind of causal principles that these types of arguments rely on. And so it's unsurprising that people who are kind of warm to a supernaturalist worldview would also call these arguments sound. But if you don't have those intuitions, if Aquinas isn't preaching to the metaphysical choir, they're just going to have to shake hands and agree to disagree. I kind of think that's generally where cosmological arguments leave us.
Sure. So I'm just going to assume, given that he's so often quoted and inspired by theologians, that he put forth arguments for God. Did he not?
Yes.
Ish. Ish. Okay. I'm interested.
So may I for a visual aid for a second?
Sure.
All right. I brought one of my copies of Aquinas' Summa Theologie, unfinished. He died before he finished it. When people cite the 5 ways, they're talking about less than 1 page of this.
1 page of that, really?
And they're just that. They're ways. They're ways one could argue, independent of Scripture, that a higher power exists. And so there are frameworks for argument. They're not intended to persuade non-believers, of course. If you could read in 13th century Europe, you were a Christian monk. And so they're just that's why I don't call these arguments failures, because they're perfectly good for what they are. But that's the context in which we're reading. Now, what contemporary scholars do is do what Aquinas probably intended. Well, they put some flesh on the bones. They started with this kind of structure and then made it into something more sophisticated and advanced. In my book, I used the first 3 of Aquinas' 5 ways to just kind of draw out what a cosmological argument would actually have to do in order to succeed nowadays, and then turn to some arguments that could possibly do that. So I think it's worth studying Aquinas, but I don't think if you're reading Aquinas to be persuaded one way or the other, you're doing the wrong thing for the 5 ways.
Well, I think that's pretty fair. So for example, Einstein. Of late, there's been this idea of emergent space-time, and one of the concepts that gets you there is a combination of 2 different papers that Einstein wrote just mere months apart, but at their core, they're unrelated. And there doesn't appear to be a reason to think that Einstein made a correlation between these two different papers. He just had the two simultaneous thoughts and wrote about them individually. But then after the fact, now people still debate to this day whether or not Einstein was really referring to this concept of emergent space-time, that quantum gravity and all of that. He wasn't. I don't think he was. But you can make the case that he was. Like maybe he just didn't have the words that we do now, so he's just spelling it out the way they did, but this is what he was thinking about. Clearly, I mean, they apply. I mean, it's almost exact. I mean, if it's not precise. So to me, I kind of get this like after the thought, post hoc reasoning that maybe they may have been referring to this other thing. So, for example, when you say that, essentially, it seems to me what you're saying is his writing was meant to be for the available audience of his time, namely monks and other theologians who were going to invest money to read things. So he was like, oh, who's the best audience? Who's going to read what I have to offer to the world? Probably these people. So is that not the case? Was it more or less like, okay, well, this is the audience I have to write for, so why write anything else?
So I'm not as good biographically, perhaps, on Aquinas, but I don't think he was intending to write for the world ever. Those were the people he was interested in talking to. It's this kind of close-knit academic community, and it's almost for like writing for your peers. So it's not just, well, these are the people I can reach. These are the people I want to reach.
Okay. Well, yeah. Okay. So that makes sense. It's just that. Okay. So his work is clearly still quoted to this day. It's influential. There are things that that are drawn from the conclusions that he made several hundred years ago. What do you think are the most persuasive arguments that he put forth that are still used today that you think are worth considering?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't.
So I
don't look to the 13th century for biology, and I'm not sure I would for philosophy.
So, would you say that he has more of a historical interest than a really theological or philosophical baggage to bring to the table today?
If you mean this exact table, that is, if we're interested in natural theology and arguments trying to show that some being of a certain sort exists, if that's the table we're at. He gives us inspiration to dig deeper in certain directions. That's it. And a citation of Aquinas is a quotation for inspiration. If you're talking about what he has to offer generally, there's a little more than that, because once you've accepted a certain type of theistic worldview, he's a goldmine. So, for instance. Nowadays, some Christians are catching up to medieval times in terms of their. Sorry, that was a little over the edge, but
that's good. Keep it coming.
Well, so you have to accept that we are biological beings. There doesn't seem to be any way around that anymore. We see evidence of evolution in the human body. We poop. We eat. We do all of these other things, and so. This trying to somehow draw a biological line between humans and animals is finally kind of starting to crumble, and people realize they can't do that anymore. But once you have that realization, back to Aquinas, right? That he gives a very nuanced account that basically starts with humans in an Aristotelian sense, and says that Aristotle was right, but not complete, because what Aristotle missed was that humans are basically ensouled animals, which obviously I don't believe that, but it is a much more plausible account than trying to somehow say humans are non-animals. And so once we are led to certain positions by evidence, I think Aquinas can be very valuable to people of religious worldviews. He also works a lot towards trying to make certain Christian doctrines coherent. And I don't mean that as a jab. Like, that is his stated position. Well, it might seem like Trinitarianism is incoherent. It might seem like transubstantiation is incoherent. And so if you already have a certain worldview and there's things about that worldview that bother you, that's probably where Aquinas' greatest strength is.
Let's start with something really simple. Well, it's not really simple. I realize this is still heavily debated, but to the layman, it's pretty clear that 3 and 1, 1 and 3, however you want to parse that, that we're clearly talking about more than one particular type of thing. If we're going to parse out individual things within this 3 and 1, long story short, you say that he's useful for maintaining that sort of position. How? Like, how does he make Trinitarianism more plausible?
That might have been a bad example because he kind of doesn't. Instead, and this is interesting and internally consistent, is about what you could hope for here. But instead, he says that there are certain things that humans are smart enough to figure out, and this is why curiosity is a good thing. There are these things that we should be using our natural faculties in order to figure out about the world, and in those areas, God is basically hands off for Aquinas. Very common view expressed in a couple of different ways. Descartes talks about the natural light of reason, et cetera, natural revelation in Spinoza. But Aquinas then says, if that's all we had, then there would be no revelation. And so he situates the role of revelation as explaining the divine mysteries, as the things that human reason and human intelligence could not in principle figure out. And he puts the Trinity in one of those for the most part. Now, having said that, he does add to the conversation by building in some of the kind of Aristotelian notion of essences and things that, kind of lubricate the philosophical gears a little bit. But yeah, so that's Aquinas gives a total and complete worldview. That is what Summa Theologie means, kind of the sum of theology. And so he's good at synthesizing and getting pieces to fit together into a coherent whole. That's a
Sounds
value.
Like a better salesman than anything. Like, because what you just told me, my walk away from that was, hey, the great mystery, the Trinity. It's a great mystery.
It is, but again, you're evaluating from 21st century.
Well, isn't that his takeaway? Didn't you say that it's just one of those things that we can't know?
No, but when you start with, assume you started with the position that the Bible is a historical text, all right?
Oh, okay.
That's a very different position to be in. So his job isn't to explain why positions that are supposedly in the Bible, which by the way, Trinitarianism is not, but to explain why things that are in the Bible, in this historical book, why are they kind of impervious to reason and kind of this mutually reifying, well, what is the value of the Bible is to give us these things that reason cannot actually. So again, it's not useful to, in certain aspects, it's useful in other aspects to certain areas.
Do you think if he were born today, he would, and had the same kind of reasoning, he would become an atheist?
Yeah, absolutely. I do not have any hesitation there. So let me give an example. I think that what we know from biblical criticism, such as the only evidence of the Bible for Trinitarianism actually being inserted into the Bible 1,000 years later, if you remove that as a historical document, thing one. If you encounter non-theistic cultures, thing two. I think that. Oh, let me add one more thing. He was perfectly happy to buck the status quo, and it might not seem like that, but he was a Dominican friar. The Dominicans had only been founded like 30 years before he was born. And so these were a new and radical group that he decided he was going to be with. His parents were also filthy rich and were very opposed to him becoming a friar, such that they imprisoned him in the family castle for a year to try to keep him away. And his brother hired a prostitute to try to tempt him. So these are all examples, not of his Christianity, but as to his dedication to leading to where he thinks he should be led. And I think if you put him in a very different situation, you'd have very different results. All those Aquinas cultists just are probably very angry right now. But all the Aquinas scholars are probably like, yeah, that's probably right. So
Aquinas cultists. Okay, so how would you describe, out of curiosity, what a modern day Aquinas cultist looks like?
So they usually get their Aquinas through seminary, and they kind of backdate after they've gone to seminary and decided everything they believe. They go to do advanced work in philosophy. The better ones to understand Aquinas better, the worst ones to kind of learn how to do the fodder and the gymnastics game. Again, not all, so there's better and worse ones. But the ones I've encountered, like the conversation just stops when I say something and he says, but Aquinas says X, and that's it. I'm like, well, what if Aquinas is wrong? And there's just like this. Yeah, exactly. That's what I mean by a cultist. And there's it's not exclusive to Aquinas. It's not exclusive to Christians. It's not exclusive to theists. There's just certain figures in the history of philosophy just kind of accumulate these fanboys that just think that the figure in question is unquestionable. Which
I've met like modern day versions of this. I mean, like there are popular theologians, apologists alive today that I think receive the Aquinas treatment. If this is what you're really talking about, like, hey man, this guy said this, and if I don't know the answer, whatever you're asking me right now, give me a minute. Let me go talk to this guy and get back to you. It's always that one source, and what that guy says is absolute. And I have no problem believing that these like Aquinian cultist types still exist. I mean, to me, it's no.
I hope so. My PhD program wasn't that long ago.
What was that? I'm sorry.
I said I hope so. My PhD program wasn't that long ago.
Oh my goodness. Hey, by the way, I just want to thank everybody in the audience who's participating. I'm going to do my best to try to keep up with what you guys are saying here, but I just saw somebody who haven't seen it in a minute. Richard Matson. It says peace and respect to pretty much everybody on the crew here. Peace and respect to you too, brother. I haven't seen you in a while. It's nice to see you again. But anyway, sorry. Again, I'm just going to try to do my best to keep up with you guys in the audience. So if you do have any questions, comments, or concerns for anybody on the panel tonight, by all means, throw them out there. I actually... okay, I'm sorry. Looks like we have a question here. He was arguably the best scholastic philosopher. Aquinas, that is. Why? Do you agree with that statement from Skeptic Haven, Dr. Lorkowski? That he was arguably the best scholastic philosopher?
I think that's right.
Of his age, anyway? I'll go ahead and just add that.
No, so scholasticism is kind of age-restricted. Scholasticism was this medieval attempt to synthesize the philosophy of the ancients with Catholic doctrine.
Actually, that's an interesting choice of words. That was something that I had thought about a little. I was thinking about the topic because I remembered that we were going to be talking about the 5 ways as what I thought we were going to be
we still
focused
can.
on.
They're just not going to take long.
You know what? Let's do that. I just lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. So the 5 ways. Let's go ahead and tangent into that. Let's segue into that. We got more than enough time. The 5 ways, when I think of Aquinas, this is almost always the thing that comes up in conversation. At least whenever I hear Aquinas come up, it's almost always in reference to the, quote, 5 ways. And it seems as though, in my personal experience, it's almost kind of like a got you. Like if you know 3 out of 5, you didn't pass the test, so you're not even worth kind of talking to. But my thing is I like to tackle these things individually. Always have. We can talk about them individually, but and we will, as a matter of fact. So let's do that. So let's go over the 5 ways. What are the 5 ways, and what is their purpose?
So, background: there's nothing special about the number 5. He gave all of these arguments he gave as arguments, by Catholicism that show that a higher power exists. But he doesn't say they're his in the Summa contra Gentiles, which is another work. And then he lists the fifth way, actually the third way in the numbering, as an argument from the great Islamic scholar Avicenna. But nevertheless, even though he's giving these as other people's arguments, he very clearly kind of makes them his own and spruces them up and endorses them in the Summa Theologie. Now, what they are in general, one of the things Aquinas and the scholastics more generally did is they wrote in the way of Aristotle, which is to say, he'd start with a question. He'd give, here's some reasons to say yes. Here's some reasons to say no. Here's what I have to say. And so on the existence of God, the question is, can you show that there's a God independent of revelation? And so he says, well, here's some reasons to say yes. And he gives Anselm's ontological argument, which he dismisses as utterly impossible to work. Props for Aquinas for that. Here's some reasons to say no. Problem of evil, his rejection of the problem of evil, not so hot. And here's my answer. Here's 5 ways. I don't know the level of familiarity with some of the technical stuff in philosophy of religion of the audience, but at least 4 of the 5 ways are usually considered what are called cosmological arguments. This is a family of natural theology arguments that their common thread is they start with some very basic pre-scientific observation about the world, and then you try to show that that implies some sort of first being. And they do so using a causal principle like the principle of sufficient reason. That's what all cosmological arguments have in common. Notice that also implies they would need a lot more argument to get to a very specific description of a deity, such as a god of theism, such as a god of Christianity. At least Aquinas' first 4 of the 5 ways are probably cosmological arguments. The 5th is probably a weird deductive design argument. That's weird because they're not usually deductive. So in my book, I introduced the first 2 ways as kind of a really good, just paragon example of what cosmological arguments are trying to do. Because you can't use simple cosmological arguments anymore. You have to get into the advanced ones, but at least to understand what they're supposed to do, Aquinas is a great teaching tool. So the first 2 ways are pretty much perfectly parallel. The first way is called from motion. Well, that's your very general pre-scientific fact about the world. Stuff moves. Anybody but Parmenides is going to grant that. So next step, motion doesn't just happen, causal principle. We should probably be thinking in terms of kinetic motion for the purposes of this argument. Obviously, Aquinas didn't know about electrons whizzing around and that kind of thing, but we don't fault philosophers for not having time machines. So in kinetic motion, something cannot be both mover and moved in one and the same motion. But, says Aquinas, an infinite regress of movers is impossible. Therefore, there must be a first unmoved mover. Before we get into that, let me just state the second way, which again is almost identical, except it's from cause and effect. So here's a pre-scientific fact about the world. There is cause and effect. But something can't be both cause and effect in one and the same event. Even Hume would grant that. So you know you're on good grounds with the skeptics there. But an infinite chain of cause and effect is impossible. Therefore, there is an uncaused cause. Let's talk about why those don't work. There's 2 big reasons. One, when I say don't work, I mean unpersuasive. So one, they rely on this intuition that an infinite regress is impossible. That things can't go back forever. You could do some weird thought experiments to try to establish that, but you don't really have anything else. And if you're actually having a dialogue between a theist and an atheist, you're quickly going to discover this is a non-starter assumption. People who believe infinite regresses are impossible are usually already theists. People who are atheists usually already deny that.
Well, how about this? Just to stir the pot a bit, I don't believe in an infinite regress. Like I'm just willing to just say that I'm so not convinced that it's possible as an atheist that I just think that it is impossible. Like, I'm just more convinced that it's impossible than possible. And the reason why I think this is that when we get into actual infinities, I feel that there's just certain absurdities that are unresolvable that that by virtue of their unresolvability and the fact that we don't require an infinite regress for something like an existent universe, we can reject it.
So that's fine. I think you're going to. I think you're coming on stronger than a lot stronger than you would need to here, and that's probably going to get you into trouble in terms of kind of your debate creds. Just it's too much. So, for instance, you have by fiat ruled out the oscillation model of the universe that some people still think is alive and well. Just actually saw an article about it in Science Magazine last week. And some people think that, well, Big Bang, Big Crunch, Big Bang, Big Crunch, back forever. I think so. I'm not saying you should think this, but my personal view is, I have a PhD in a concentration, an area of specialization in metaphysics. And if you ask me if an infinite regress is possible, I said, I don't know. I don't know one way or the other. And at minimum, in an argument, the premises need to be more certain than the conclusion. Otherwise, an argument doesn't work. And so even saying I don't know on that is plenty. Now, having said that, are there people who say infinite regresses are impossible? Sure. And I don't know for sure one way or the other. I think there's a lot of weirdnesses with infinity, but I think there's a lot of weirdnesses, period. Once we get on like the big cosmological level of things, like space expands. My head hurts. Like that's weird. That doesn't prove it's impossible. But having said that, I'm not saying your view is wrong. I'm just saying, I don't know. B, I don't need to know. But that's my personal view on it.
Well, I think that the issue is that for theologians, they do need to know, at least, because if that's sort of like the point. Like, you either believe and you're good, or you don't, you're damned. So, like, this need to know is a bit more, like, urgent than it might be for the vast majority. But, like, my position, like, I grant, like, if you don't believe it, I don't give a shit. By the way, I'm sorry. It's not, you're okay to cuss. I'm trying to keep it down. Like, I don't care. Like if you believe what I believe, it doesn't have real implications on much of anything until we start getting into some of the more moral thing.
My focus isn't on belief; it's about my focus is on dialogue. I'm not one of the new atheists. I don't believe shouting at people you disagree with is in any way conducive to learning, and so that's When I'm talking about what's helpful and what's not, that's a very separate issue from what we ought to believe and what we ought not. But if you're trying to find common ground, and if you're talking with a theist who's willing to discuss things reasonably, then just make the weaker claim if the weaker claim still gets the job done. But there is a second worry. If you think any infinity is possible, if you think any infinity is impossible, you've already ruled out theism by fiat, and they're just going to say you begged the question. Right? So
I like that. Yeah.
But one of the things I said as a result, though, is a good cosmological argument, that is one that is persuasive enough that we have to consider it, doesn't use the infinite regress principle. That's one of the things we learned from Aquinas, because he has to be preaching to the metaphysical choir in order to make that kind of argument work. And so if you're talking to an atheist naturalist, that's a different conversation. So, but there's a second worry, and I think the second worry is much, 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 much bigger, is the conclusions are compatible with atheist naturalism, right? Well, there's an uncaused cause. Of course, I call it the Big Bang. There's an unmoved mover. Of course, I call it the Big Bang singularity. Again, I don't fault Aquinas for not having a time machine, but now that we know about Big Bang cosmogony, I don't think you can have a conversation about the success or failure of cosmological arguments without talking about what we know of as the beginning of the universe, at least as we know it.
That's a very good point, because I've actually, of late, especially in my life, I've noticed this trend. Maybe this is just the way that my worldview has shifted over the years, but I have noticed that I'm willing to have a conversation about what I believe and not merely my, I'm not unsure about. So, like infinite regress thing. I just believe that not the case. So I'm willing to have that conversation about the implications and be proven wrong on such things. And when we get down to these fundamental ideas like the infinite regress and so forth, like I said, that they just have this draw, this impulse that needs to be resolved in us. That I think playing the field, like playing the middleman ground, I think that the timid route that is has its place for sure, especially when you're sort of introducing yourself into a conversation. But at the end of the day, I think that we can really talk about the real likelihood of these things, and like, I'm sorry, we're getting sidetracked from this because ultimately, what I was willing to say was I agree with a lot of things that the theists do, such as I think there is a quote-unquote first cause, if you will. I just have a different perspective on what that means. I do think that there is something responsible for space-time, matter, and energy and all that stuff that isn't space-time, matter, and energy. I do think there is something that is responsible for, or that exists outside of our perception of time, that is responsible for the existence of space and time and all of that stuff. I just don't think this thing is a person. And so at the end of the day, when my biggest disconnect is this idea that the fundamental thing that we're all actually trying to talk about is a person. That's where I can't get on board. It seems to me that Aquinas would probably agree with me, I would imagine, if I had a chance to sit down and talk with him, that there probably is something responsible for all of everything that isn't like all of everything. That's just different. That's just, it's always been there, always is, and he might call that God, and might think it's a person even, and I think that that's just, him being a product of his time, and I think that's the case for most of us. We just have this impulse to think that we need to be grateful to something. Long story short, I'm going to go on, so you need to, like, inject here, somebody, because I will meander all night. I just think that the biggest misconception that we have is we want to include our biases onto what it is that we're actually talking about. We're talking about the thing responsible for all things, and yet a lot of times we're struck with bewilderment and awe and gratefulness. I can look at a sunset in my sun, an amazing view, and just I still to this day have this urge to be grateful. So I can imagine trying to conflate these ideas subconsciously or consciously even, and try to make all the pieces come together here. So to think that this ultimate source for all of everything is a person, I think is the superfluous thought. Sorry, J. Mike here has a comment or a question. He says, thoughts on existential inertia and its role on conjunction with essence, existence. I don't understand that question, actually. I think he's speaking over my head. Anybody understand that? I'm sorry, J. Mike. Nobody here, I don't think, understands exactly what it is you're trying to say there.
Well, in the meantime, I have a question. More like a remark. We're talking about whether infinite regress is possible or not, but I think that what we are forgetting and pushing away is that we cannot know at the moment. Especially when we speak about the universe, before the Planck time, we have no idea what happens, and we have no way of knowing right now. So any conclusion that is based on this specific premise cannot be valid in any way, because we cannot know. We don't have the means to find out.
Yeah, and I think I think I probably I would like to touch on both fronts for a moment, because I think there actually is a relation there. One of the things I work very hard to do in my text is, I try to give theists as much as they can, because as David Hume was purported to have said, truth springs from disagreement amongst friends, and I think that's how we should do philosophy. And one of the things I ended up, the position I think the cosmological arguments end up at. So we've already talked about, well, Aquinas is nice, but we have to talk about interpretation of the Big Bang, or it's meaningless. And so that motivates looking at what I take to be the best cosmological arguments, which are William Lane Craig's Kalam, because that has the relevant feature. Now, am I convinced? Of course not. But I ultimately think things like the cosmological argument, and this gets to Caleb's point first, are awash. They're disagreements in some of our most fundamental intuitions. Well, is an eternally conscious being less weird than an uncaused Big Bang. And notice I say less weird, because once we're talking cosmology, it's crazy. It's incomprehensible, I should say, either way. Now, to go back to Sidney's point then, once we're talking about the Big Bang, we know the Big Bang happened. Do we know how it happened, why it happened? Not as of now, which means people like William Lane Craig are giving an interpretation of the event. And there are other interpretations of the event. And so ultimately, how you're going to evaluate the best cosmological arguments is what is the best interpretation of this kind of event. Now, Sidney's point is a really good one, and one I mentioned in a different chapter in the book, is theism has a history of, Christianity specifically has a history of trying to get out ahead of the science and being proven wrong and then scaling back. So think of a literal 6-day creation, Earth 6,000 years old, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, we have to be really careful because I'm going to have so many qualifications in this, I'm sad, but I feel like I must make a qualification. Any sentence that starts with the two words, all Christians, I will bet you $100 it's false, because there's just so much disagreement there. In my world religions courses, we do this. We just have the class put a bunch of beliefs of Christians on the board, and then I put a line through all of them that is rejected by at least some Christians, and the answer is all. But having said that, there's general trends and influential sects within Christianity that do this. They get out ahead of the science. Science proves them wrong. Dial it back. So think of design arguments that were, based on the structure of the human eye. Oh, that's so purposive. That has to be divine intervention. Well, then we find out, no, we know it's explained by natural evolutionary processes. Oh, well, the divine intervention was in fixing the laws of evolution. And so there is a worry. And first of all, props for theists for being willing to put beliefs on the chopping block. If science proves you wrong, then the props would go to admitting that. So are they putting out things in ways that science could theoretically disprove? Yes. And if you're intellectually honest about that, if you say, I think religion is the best explanation for phenomenon X, and therefore it went this way, and science disproves that, and you say, oh, well, I guess I was wrong there. Great. Wonderful. I love testable hypotheses in philosophy of religion, and I want to see more. But ultimately, there's a worry there, right? Eventually, science, astrophysics might be able to do some experiment at CERN, something like that might be able to replicate some of the conditions that might provide an explanation for some of the events before the 360,000-year horizon at the Big Bang. And maybe we will have a better understanding, and maybe we'll see the face of God. Who knows? But yes, we do have to have this recognition that, first of all, science and religion belong in places where, sorry, did I say science and religion? Philosophy and religion belong in places that are not science places. Definitionally, I believe, this is from Bertrand Russell, what philosophy does is a structured, reasoned approach to trying to answer questions that the sciences can't. And I think anytime philosophy or religion steps on the science's toes, they're in for a hurting, and rightly so, and they shouldn't be there. And so, yes, theistic debate should happen at things outside of scientific confirmability. Absolutely, and that's why we need philosophy of religion. Now, I've rambled on too long, so I'll pause there.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of faith in humanity anymore. I've noticed that as I've gotten older, I see these trends, and this could be just this is purely anecdotal, but the Christians in my life are all fundamentalists, young earthers. I know very few, aside from my actual friends that I've still maintained to this day that still come and hang out with me, which is maybe I have 4 or 5 left that are still Christian, that aren't fundamentalists. But everybody in my life that's important to me that's a Christian is fundamentalist Christian. 6 to 10,000 years, and excuse me, most of the conversations that I have with Christians over the interwebs are with young earthers, and I get the same basic justification for all of this, and that is that the Bible is the ultimate source, and so if we just take the words of this particular script and take it from there, then all else is solved. But the problem that I run into as well, and I see this amongst these individuals within their own group, is that these literalists, they don't recognize that the words aren't specific enough to have a, quote, literal interpretation that's indistinguishable from another, or excuse me, that's irrefutable, I suppose is the way to put that. Because you have two, at least, people in the room that claim to be biblical literalists that have very different... Like, so for example, just today, even, I was just talking to two biblical literalists, and somebody asked a really bizarre question, but I actually thought was kind of interesting in the grand scheme, which was, what before the fall, did Adam and Eve ever step on a bug? Did that ever happen? Did they ever accidentally inhale a spider in their sleep? I mean, did these sort of things just not happen? Were bugs immortal because there was no death before the fall? Like, so these sort of like weird, bizarre questions, which there just is no answer for. You can take every word of the Bible, take it absolutely 100% literal, and try to answer that, and you're not going to be able to do it. There is no literal answer to that at all. It just doesn't exist. I'm sorry, we're getting way off topic. I miss you, Bryce. I love you, man. I hope you're feeling better next week. So in the meantime, before I get too sidetracked, we are running up on our hour, and this is usually about the point where we start asking the audience for questions. And I have noticed, thank you to our audience, that they have been engaging. There are a handful of questions in here. And it looks like, I'm sorry, Dr. Lorkowski, it looks like most of these are probably going to be for you, being our the only doctor in the room. So technically, I think you're really the only one worth talking. No offense, Cindy. I'm sorry. That was probably mean.
No. I just like to point out that there is one comment that made me laugh. It's Otangelo talking about pseudoscience when mentioning abiogenesis, and that's hilarious coming from him. That's just what I wanted to say. Yeah, go ahead. There was one question from.
Did you have one in particular? By the way, it looks like we have a J. Mike who was in the audience a minute ago. I was actually just looking at some of his questions. J. Mike, thank you for joining us, brother.
Hey, can you hear me?
I hear you just fine.
Sweet. Yeah, no, I'm secretly a Thomist, and I just came in here to debate Dr. Lorkowski. No, I'm just kidding. I really appreciate it. I want to go back and listen to all this. I was just curious because I'm kind of rusty on this myself. It's been a while since I've looked into Thomism, but in regard to like the Aristotelian proof, I know Phaser, cites this a lot in his book on the 5 proofs, but. Are you familiar with the concept of existential inertia?
Are you talking about the Aquinas potential versus actuality and motion?
Yeah. So like the idea, I think it's like in reference to like the per se and per accidents type of causal series, right? Where it's like, I can't remember which one, but my hand pushes the stick, it pushes the ball. And the kind of the idea is to get to God, right? Well, so like I know Joe Schmidt had wrote a paper on it as well, but the idea, I was curious what you thought about this idea or as a potential, I guess it's more of like from my understanding, like a aspect of parsimony or just explanatory virtue and simplicity. And so what they're going to posit is that God is sustaining all causes, right? And they want to get to God at the bottom. But if we just suppose, which it seems that they're supposing the falsity of the existential inertia thesis, which is the idea that all objects just have this feature to persist in existence without, like, unless something puts it out of existence, right? And it seems that one assumption doesn't require this kind of metaphysical baggage of sustaining causes and things like that, right? You could just simply posit this idea that objects will go persisting on in existence, and you don't need to suppose sustaining causes. And I was curious on what you thought of that, or and because that kind of goes into relation with the essence and existence distinction on the existence being imposed on the essences and things like that.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of connections that are actually interesting. So start with Caleb's point about why call the first being intelligent. That's exactly this worry between the transition between Aristotle's argument, which is the prime mover, which has nothing to do with intelligence, but is the basis for motion, in the Aquinian intellectus that does it. Now, but the second thing I wanted to mention from that is there's some Aquinas scholars thinks you could kind of collapse the five ways, that they're all based on kind of the same reasoning, and there's others who think it's not. So the third way, which we never got to from contingency, is actually the one where this comes in the most, because the way from contingency actually is, first of all, it's a virtue that it doesn't require us to say that infinite regresses are impossible. In fact, the premise allows an infinite temporal regress. But to make the argument valid, we have to use a different notion of causation than we're used to. And of course, Aquinas isn't doing anything shifty here. Aristotle had four notions of causes, and subdivide that into causes of being. But they're just antique and we don't use them anymore. And so, as J. Mike mentioned, Aquinas had this thought that things basically had to be held in existence in a certain way. And by Aquinas had this thought, I mean Aquinas and 2,000 years of people prior to Aquinas had this thought. It wasn't until I believe Leibniz is the first one I saw it in writing that, well, no, substance's nature is to subsist, and you actually have to have extraordinary action to get rid of it. So as a result, in order to realize why Aquinas' third way is not invalid, you have to know the difference between causa secundum esse and causa secundum fiere, which is the cause of something's being and the cause of it being the way it is. And this is a long roundabout way of saying it's because both of those things require an explanation that we can't just say it's in their nature to be. That would be fine for causa secundum esse, but Aquinas is going to put this extra epistemic burden on and say, but what's causing it to be what it is? And that's what you can't just say things persist at what they are, because things are subject to generation and corruption. If they didn't need a cause for being what they are, then we'd all be immortal and eternal and all sorts of weird stuff. And so that's the short answer of that's why Aquinas can't cut it out. Now, should we accept that requirement? Well, I don't think so. But point being is Aquinas was kind of in an epistemic corner for his demands for explanation for why he couldn't just say that.
Sure, yeah, and so it seems like it's just going to beg the question against, like, if somebody posits this existential inertia thesis, right, that things will just go on persisting. I mean, isn't that thesis, from the Thomist perspective, isn't it just going to beg the question against something like that clearly is explained and seems to be a feature of just all things that exist in some, spatio-temporal location or something, right? That's just going to be some kind of, and I'm a nominalist, so I don't really think properties and things exist.
Yeah, me too. But
yeah, so but I still think there's a way, and Oppie makes this point that you can just kind of, right, and especially when the essence existence thing, it's like he makes this point that it would be weird to say like, Russell Burchett doesn't exist right now, and his essence has like the property of once existing, right? But we can just suppose, instead of this existence being sustained on the essences by God, we just can suppose that these things just have this feature to just go on. It seems to undercut, at least from my perspective, to just completely undercut the entire notion.
Yeah, so yes, it certainly does. But what we'd have to do is actually look at Aquinas' reasons for saying what he does about being. So just to follow up on what you said, for Aquinas, being is just an accidental predicate when it's simply expressing existence at a particular time. and accidents require explanation. And so that's the short answer to why I'd say that. I think in terms of why we might say that, well, Aquinas didn't have a time machine, and he didn't know about things like these, eternal atoms that are the same and have been the same for 13 billion years. And so I think if he realized that, maybe he might say something different about being. But yeah, he's
and I actually appreciate your kind of lens on that, because that's a lot that I think's missed out when people are engaging these arguments, is what they're privileged to, at least in terms of the information or purported evidence. But yeah, it seems like there's a cost too, right? But it's like you accept this distinction, and now you accept the idea that there are non-existent things, right, that have these essences, and that seems to just be an absurd view that I don't know who would want that in their ontology or metaphysics, right? But I think your perspective of the lens that they're coming from, and whether or not they'd be updated given the information we have, I think is a very very good point and a humbling point. So I appreciate that.
Sure, and to just to kind of stay on point for the show, I'm not an Aquinas. I'm not an Aquinas. I am in no way persuaded by virtually any assumption that Aquinas makes, but those are claims about his views and his premises. It's not views about him as a person. One of my absolute favorite philosophers, contemporary philosophers, I probably disagree with every word he's ever written, but I think he goes about philosophy in the right way, and I think that that's always worth kind of emphasizing. To go back to Caleb's last point about, well, when you're dealing with the crazies, well, we can also deal with the good ones too, right? And those are I think engaging people who think about these matters in the right way, whether you agree with them or not, is going to do a couple things. One, it's going to build a dialogue. Two, we better do it, because to just start with the assumption that we're right and they're wrong, regardless of any further evidence or argument, is dogmatism to the extreme, and doing things that we fault certain theists for doing. We should always be open to more evidence, and we should accept the possibility that maybe one day we will be convinced to a different worldview. And if you don't allow that possibility, you shouldn't be allowed to talk on a show, right? It's just we should be first and foremost evidentialists, and our highest commitment should be to evidence and to lead that wherever it goes. And anybody who is of that mindset, whether they're theist or atheist or anything in between, I will love to have a conversation with them.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you for answering. Oh, sorry, Caleb. I didn't mean to interrupt
go ahead,
you.
brother. You go ahead and say
I just wanted to thank him for answering the questions. I appreciate that. You do. You as a real philosopher do good service to us bedroom philosophers, so we appreciate it. Even though I don't even consider myself a philosopher, but someone who just engages in the literature to a small degree, we appreciate that. So thank you.
To the philosophizers out there.
Yeah, philosophizers. I like that. That's okay. I'm okay with that.
Finance, but this is way more fun.
Yeah, I just I do a show with a friend, and he's getting his PhD, and so I don't feel like there's a distinction in the effort that I make and the effort that he makes. So I just want to make sure that that line is drawn. So.
And I really appreciate both of you guys, especially you, J-Mac, for just randomly decided to have the goal to come on and have a conversation with us. But because I honestly, that takes a lot of courage, so thank you for that.
I'm glad I got a second to come in, so thank you. Appreciate it.
No, I appreciate you too, my man. And by the way, if I get your pronouns wrong, I'm very sorry about that. I'm still
I'm fine. I'm fine with he, him, but
I recognize that I say these things, and anyway,
it's all good. No worries.
Lorkowski, I also, man, thank you so much for coming on tonight. You are very entertaining, very informative, and I also wanted to say that I really appreciate how you come about describing how you feel about Aquinas. That even if you disagree with the man, you appreciate how he goes about, at least, and explaining his philosophy, and you think that more people should aspire to such standards. And I actually agree with you on that on so many different levels. As I said, I found in my later years that, as hard it is to admit, I've been finding myself agreeing with a lot of these subtle points that that we've sort of been talking about. Things like, I don't agree in an infinite regress. I think there was a first cause and these sort of things. So when I'm engaged in these conversations, I tend to feel like an outsider in my own community because I'm not, most of the people that I affiliate with aren't willing to be as sure-footed, I guess, in their position. I can't remember how you phrased it. Overly confident, I suppose, or something like that. I believe what I believe, and I'm willing to say what I believe, and I'm willing to be proven wrong, and I want to be proven wrong. And so I tend to come across as a bit of a know-it-all in that way. But please, by all means, correct me on absolutely anything. But the point is at the end of the day, I'm willing to grant all of these points that. We really ought to consider these, the fact that, it's difficult. No, we should consider these views and try to put ourselves in the shoes of these people as well. Like you were saying, Aquinas today probably would be more in our camp than the theologians had he been around. But, he was born several hundred years ago, so he's a product of his time. So we can't really judge him too harshly for that. And I hope that people in the future look at me in the same way. I'm sure I'm going to be wrong about a lot of crap, and I hope they can, give me a little grain of salt with my opinions, given that the time and place that I live. And I'm willing to do the same for Aquinas. And I think that you've spoken quite well, not only on his behalf, but also just to reiterate that, look, he's a great philosopher, probably even a good person, but we should still maintain, an unbiased perspective as to what he's actually saying, even though he's saying it very well. His arguments are not persuasive, and at the end of the day, but he's a great example of what it is to be a good philosopher, and I think that's the way that you put it is far more eloquent, than I ever will. That's one of my failings. But anyway, again, at the end of the day, I just wanted to thank you. I wanted to also thank, I'm sorry, I forgot his name already. The other gentleman that was on here earlier, Cindy, I want to thank you very much as well. And then before we go, I just wanted to give you guys one last chance to spot yourself. Cindy, I haven't heard you talk so much tonight, so I'm going to go ahead and give you the floor first real quick. Go ahead and tell everybody where they can find you and what you're up to these days.
So I'm part of this channel on the former PSF network and now Skeptic Haven channel called Women Atheists Unload, where we talk about everything, not just women issues, but all issues, mostly from our perspective. But not only, we talk about science and skepticism and all those topics. I'm also on my own channel, The Path to Reason, where I talk about problems through the lens of critical thinking, which I've been working on in the last 10 years. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
All right. Well, again, thank you for joining on. I don't know if you, I honestly, and I'm sorry to say this also, I don't know if you joined last minute because Bryce wasn't able to join, but either way,
I did,
thank you so much. And by the way, again, I'm sorry for those who miss him. I miss him too. We miss you, Bryce, very much. We hope to see you next week, and we certainly hope you feel better. Dr. Lorkowski, thank you one last time for joining us today. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to just tell people what you're up to these days and where they might be able to find you. And go ahead and throw yourself out there, brother.
So, first, a qualifier. I'm really not a medieval scholar, so I apologize if I expressed anything unclearly or off. If I'm doing history of philosophy, it's early modern, and I do Hume, and I do Kant, and I do Spinoza. So that's my Aquinas dabbling. But I'm interested in contemporary philosophy of religion. I read a book on it. I'm currently working on a paper about whether there's a problem with eternal bliss in terms of kind of this forced boredom. But overall, I do philosophy because I love philosophy, and I think it's very valuable at the introductory level. I love teaching intro classes because I think I have no interest in converting people to atheism. I don't, because what I actually think is I try to convert people to reasoning well, and I think if you reason well, then your beliefs end up being correct beliefs, or more importantly, non-harmful beliefs. And maybe the best position to end on is, as much as I could talk for hours on cosmological arguments, ontological arguments, and design arguments, but at the end of the day, they don't really matter. And in the sense that that's not where the problems come from. Like, we don't feel the need to have this kind of show because people believe in a higher power who might be good, right? The real in the trenches fights are, even assuming a cosmological argument worked and there was a higher power, that would not cause a lot of conflict. Instead, what I'm really interested in is trying to undermine aspects of religion that are harmful, and I'm very fine and tolerant and cool with anybody of a religion that doesn't do massive harm to anyone. And so I don't consider myself as anti-religious. I think that religious people are wrong in certain beliefs. But first of all, everybody has beliefs that are false. Everybody has spots where they're irrational. So to say a belief is wrong, even if I say that's not a smack in the face, right? That's not putting a giant skull and crossbones next to it. Where I really have problems is where you have repressed communities due to religion, lack of initiative on climate emergency due to religion, just convoluted and horrific ethics due to religion, and things like that. And that's why my conversations are usually amicable, because I'm chatting with other theistic philosophers who don't have those types of beliefs, because the support for those beliefs is atrocious. And so this is a long story short of saying, well, these are great topics, but are they the topics that are near and dear to me? Philosophy is interesting, but that's not really my jam. So let me just, if I seemed a little disinterested in Aquinas, that's why.
Hey, I don't blame you, man. I you know what? We're on the same level as far as that's concerned. I hope and I believe, because I don't want to misrepresent you, but I feel it. So again, thank you, Dr. Lorkowski, author of Atheism Considered, and Cindy Plaza. Thank you both very much. Thank you, everybody in the audience, for participating and being interested. Please like and subscribe if you like what you see, and we'll see you next week on Secular Soapbox.
Find myself wondering what did happen to the last 10. I ran away with my life, fast forward, never turn back again. It's kind of funny that the more we pass time, the more we need to set the rewind. And 19 was the year I had to leave you, but now I'm seeing all the signs. Is this really happening? I can't believe it's true.